Some stories of the Second World War never made it into museums, into official histories bound in leather and gold, or into the sweeping, sepia-toned narratives of documentaries. They were not the grand, epic-defining battles of Stalingrad or the hedgerow hell of Normandy. They were the footnotes, the anomalies, the dark tangents scratched out on forgotten blueprints. These stories did not fade from memory through the simple, passive mechanism of time, a mere consequence of veterans passing and archives gathering dust. No, these particular stories were not forgotten. But because they were buried. They were deliberately and decisively interred beneath layers of bureaucratic silence, military pragmatism, and, perhaps most tellingly, sheer, stark terror. They were the secrets deemed too corrosive, too morally or technically outlandish, even for the men who had sanctioned the most monstrous acts of the 20th century. As the late autumn of 1944 bled into a desperate winter, the stage was set for the final, gruesome collapse. The once invincible machinery of the Third Reich, that 12-year, dark nightmare that had metastasized across Europe, was not merely losing, it was collapsing inward like a dying star. The perimeter of Fortress Europe had been breached, the eastern and western fronts were closing like the jaws of a trap, and the very air above Berlin was thick with the dust of frantic, doomed improvisation. It was in this atmosphere of utter desperation, where technical audacity met military panic, that the paper trail of the project known as Nebelgeist began to circulate. The paper trail of panic. In the crumbling infrastructure of the Nazi state, the wheels of its vast, labyrinthine bureaucracy still ground on, albeit erratically. When a project carried the scent of a potential, miracle weapon, a wonderwaffe, it was automatically routed through the highest, secretive echelons of the war machine. It was a macabre internal lottery. A file stamped with such potential would bypass the standard procurement channels, instead landing on the desks of the men responsible for the Reich's most radical, often genocidal, scientific endeavors. The Nebelgeist file, a thick manila folder filled with complex mathematics, circuit diagrams, and theoretical physics, found its way into this dark current. It wasn't about rockets or jet fighters, it dealt in a far more abstract, almost occult science, the invisible manipulation of the electromagnetic spectrum. It was a proposal for a weapon that seemed to defy the very laws of defensive warfare. It made the rounds. It landed first at the headquarters of the Abwehr, Foreign Intelligence and Counter-Espionage. Though its reputation had been irrevocably stained by internal power struggles and a series of spectacular failures and betrayals, the technical wing still possessed some of the Reich's most acute scientific minds dedicated to electronic warfare and signal interception. The Abwehr rejected it, not because they lacked the technical capacity to understand the underlying theory. Indeed, their analysts likely grasped the devastating potential better than anyone, but because the engineering complexity and the sheer, raw electrical power required made it an immediate and impossible drain on the Reich's dwindling resources. They noted in their marginalia the projected cost in copper, tungsten, and high-purity rare earth elements, materials already earmarked for vital radar systems and the V-Waffen program. The consensus was a cold, pragmatic assessment, fascinating theory, impossible implementation under current strategic constraints. The file moved on, slipping into the cold, concrete bunkers of the Luftwaffe High Command. Field Marshal Göring's Air Force, once the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg, was now a spectral force, its runways ravaged by Allied bombing, its planes grounded for lack of fuel, and its pilots fighting a losing battle against overwhelming numbers. What they desperately needed was a cheap, easily produced fighter, or a reliable, long-range reconnaissance platform. The Luftwaffe refused it. Their aeronautical engineers were mesmerized by the radical nature of the aircraft's proposed design, a stubby, heavy-set airframe built primarily to house a gigantic, humming magnetron assembly, its entire lift and thrust profile secondary to its weapon system. But the proposal's final sentence, detailing the estimated operational lifespan of the main weapon component before catastrophic failure, was enough to earn a dismissive stamp. It promised a single, destructive strike before the plane would likely have to ditch or explode. In late 1944, the Luftwaffe could not afford to gamble its most precious resource, the handful of highly trained, irreplaceable pilots remaining, on a one-shot, self-immolating experimental craft. The ultimate arbiter. Finally, the file arrived at the ultimate arbiter of all things technically and morally depraved, the offices of the SS, the Schutzstaffel. If any branch of the German war machine was equipped to embrace the project, it was the SS. This organization had already demonstrated an unnerving readiness to pursue any technological advantage, no matter the human or ethical cost. They were the architects of the Ahnenerbe, a research branch devoted to occult science and pseudo-history, and the overseers of the concentration camps, which served as both sites of industrialized murder and macabre, unethical scientific testing. They were the men who tested nerve agents like Tabun and Sarin on prisoners, experimented with exotic poisons, and wholeheartedly backed the suicidal Sonderkommando Elbe, manned, one-way missions of ramming Allied bombers. The SS Technical Division studied the file for longer than anyone else. They were intrigued by the concept of creating a purely technical, non-explosive weapon that offered absolute, localized tactical superiority. They could see the value in an aircraft that could erase an entire defensive line's communication and targeting capabilities in a single, silent pass. It spoke to their philosophy of surgical, total annihilation. Yet, even here, a line was drawn. A limit of acceptable risk, however paradoxical, was finally reached. The proposal was sent back to its originator. The note was a single, stark assessment, scrawled in black ink across the cover page by a high-ranking SS colonel, a man who had personally signed off on experiments far more horrific than this. Operational testing is unacceptable, risk level incompatible with any pilot. This verdict, from the very organization that embraced suicide craft and human experimentation, stands as the most chilling testament to the true, terrifying nature of the project. It was deemed a threat not just to the enemy, but to the very nature of the man flying it. The project's name was simply Nebelgeist, the Ghost in the Mist, a fitting title for a concept that promised to shroud the battlefield in electronic chaos, leaving its victims blind and helpless, a ghost of a target flying through a self-created, localized storm of electromagnetic ruin. To understand the Nebelgeist, the physics of its destructive power and the psychology of its rejection, one must first understand the man who conceived it. The project was not a committee-driven effort or the result of a military requirement, it was the singular, feverish vision of one mind, Dr. Erhard Kranz. Kranz was an aeronautical engineer of undeniable genius, a man who had earned his place in the Reich's technological elite with a string of brilliant, if highly temperamental, designs. But the accolades were always accompanied by a dangerous caveat. He was universally known as a man both brilliant and unstable, a rare combination of pure scientific intellect and a profound, reckless disregard for practical safety or established limits. He was the kind of engineer whose designs were almost too beautiful in theory, only to reveal fatal flaws in testing, stress fractures in vital components, unexpected harmonic vibrations at high speed, or, on one memorable occasion, a catastrophic failure of a newly designed wing structure that nearly cost the life of test pilot Captain Erich Baumer. The running joke in the design bureaus was that Kranz didn't push boundaries, he pushed them until something broke, and sometimes, the something was an aircraft, a budget, or a man's career. The obsession. The unstoppable bomber. Kranz had been obsessed with one problem since the early days of the war, an obsession that only grew more fervent as the Allied bomber stream grew from a trickle to a devastating, relentless deluge. His quest was simple to state, yet seemingly impossible to achieve. How to create a bomber that could strike a target before any defense could react. This wasn't a tactical or strategic problem for Kranz, it was an intellectual and philosophical challenge. The Allies had countered every German innovation with their own. High-altitude bombers were met with pressurized cabin fighters. High speed was countered with better interceptor placement and early warning. The development of radar, particularly the Allied centimetric radar which saw through clouds and darkness, had fundamentally shifted the balance of power, turning the night sky into a shooting gallery for German aircraft. Kranz scorned the conventional approaches. He did not seek marginal improvements in speed, because he knew the Allied jet programs would soon catch up. He did not chase higher altitude, recognizing the limitations of engine performance and pilot endurance. And he had no patience for early attempts at stealth, which in the 1940s meant little more than the application of rudimentary radar-absorbent paint, a camouflage that faded in the face of increasingly powerful detection systems. He rejected incremental progress. Kranz went somewhere far stranger. He decided to attack the very sense organ of modern air defense, weaponizing the invisible. Kranz's breakthrough, or his descent into madness, depending on who reviewed the file, came from his deep understanding of the principles of radar itself, radio detection and ranging. He didn't just understand how it worked to detect an aircraft, he understood the fundamental physics of its signal processing, the delicate balance of emitted versus reflected energy, and the vulnerability of the receiving equipment. He didn't just want to confuse the signal, he wanted to destroy the receiver's ability to function. Kranz believed that radar itself could be weaponized. His concept was the antithesis of the simple jamming systems already in use. Standard German jammers, such as the Kork or Doppel chaff, worked by releasing broadband noise or reflective strips to confuse the radar operator, creating spurious, indistinct echoes on the screen. Kranz's system was different. It didn't try to hide or confuse, it aimed for a devastating, localized sensory overload. He envisioned a system that, by channeling enormous, tightly focused bursts of microwave energy, far exceeding the power output of any contemporary broadcast station or military radar, could create a distortion field so intense that Allied radar would literally blind itself trying to process it. The theory of ruin. This wasn't mere electronic warfare, elektronische Kampfführung. That was the term for simple jamming, spoofing, and signal degradation. This was something else entirely. The core of the Nebelgeist concept lay in pushing an existing technology, the magnetron, the device that generated the radar's microwave pulses, to a level of power density previously considered impossible. Kranz proposed integrating a colossal, water-cooled magnetron unit, powered by a dedicated auxiliary generator and a revolutionary capacitor bank, directly into the aircraft's nose. The antenna was not a spinning dish, but a complex, focused array, a kind of electromagnetic megaphone, capable of concentrating the energy into a narrow, powerful beam. When activated, the burst of energy would not be a mere inconvenience of noise. It would be a shockwave of concentrated, high-frequency radiation. As this beam of hyper-intense microwaves hit the receiving dish of an Allied ground radar station, or worse, the airborne intercept radar of a night fighter, it would induce a current surge of unbelievable magnitude. The file described the intended effect with a chilling academic precision. Self-destructive electromagnetic obscuration through atmospheric overloading. Kranz's theory was based on two key physical phenomena. Nonlinear receiver overload. The incoming Nebelgeist signal would overwhelm the sensitive front-end amplifiers of the radar receiver. It would induce currents far beyond the tolerance of the circuit components, causing the internal vacuum tubes and crystal rectifiers, the delicate eyes of the radar, to literally burn out or fuse. This was a physical, permanent destruction of the equipment. Atmospheric plasma field. The power was so great that, in the immediate vicinity of the beam's emission, Kranz calculated the potential for the air molecules themselves to become briefly ionized, creating a localized, unstable pocket of charged particles, a rudimentary plasma. This plasma field would act as a temporary, unpredictable wall of electromagnetic turbulence, reflecting and refracting all surrounding radio and radar waves in a chaotic, impenetrable manner, hence the name, the ghost in the mist. In simple terms, brutally stripped of the mathematical elegance Kranz favored. The aircraft didn't simply hide from radar. It killed radar, and everything nearby. The secondary effects, the enormous electromagnetic pulse (EMP) generated by the system's activation, the massive drain on the airframe's power, and the terrifying proximity of the pilot to the most powerful microwave emitter ever placed in an aircraft, were the reasons the SS colonel had drawn the line. It was not just a weapon against the enemy, it was a weapon with an unacceptable chance of self-immolation. The Nebelgeist was a machine designed to fly through a storm of its own making, a momentary god of localized, electromagnetic ruin. And in that ruin, the pilot was the most vulnerable variable. The historical context. The War of the Invisible. To truly grasp the radical nature of Nebelgeist, one must appreciate the context of the Battle of the Beams, the crucial, hidden war fought between Allied and Axis scientists and engineers. This conflict over the electromagnetic spectrum was arguably as decisive to the war's outcome as the steel battles on the ground. By late 1944, the Allies had achieved near-total dominance in this invisible arena. The German Würzburg and Freya radars, once revolutionary, were now predictable and easily countered by Allied measures like window, chaff, and airborne jammers. The introduction of the Allied centimetric radar operating on the 3 and 10 cm wavelengths, using the vital cavity magnetron technology smuggled from Britain to the US, had been the game changer. These systems offered high resolution and could see German aircraft with unnerving clarity, making their defenses obsolete overnight. Kranz saw this electronic superiority as a flaw in the fabric of German defense, and he was determined to reverse it not through parity, but through total electronic violence. His plan was to take the magnetron, the component that gave the Allies their sight, and turn it into a blinding, deafening weapon of absolute electronic shock and awe. The very idea of an airborne system capable of generating such power in the mid-1940s was revolutionary, requiring breakthroughs in high-temperature superconductors and capacitor design that were just barely within the reach of the desperate German science base. This quest for power was the first technical hurdle that made the project so terrifying. To generate the necessary power for atmospheric overloading, Kranz's magnetron system had to be rated at megawatts, not kilowatts, an order of magnitude leap. The electrical output would essentially be a controlled lightning strike, momentarily powered by the aircraft's own momentum and fuel supply. The resulting forces, electrical, thermal, and mechanical, were what ultimately convinced the German high command that Nebelgeist was a weapon too hot to handle, even for a collapsing empire. The theoretical audacity of Dr. Erhard Kranz's concept now demanded a physical manifestation, a machine built to house and harness the immense, destructive electromagnetic force he had calculated. The result, the prototype designated Kranz Sondergerät 9, Kranz Special Device 9, was a chilling testament to the desperate, technologically promiscuous final years of the war. It was not merely an airplane, it was a blend of disparate, high-risk technologies forcibly married together for a singular, destructive purpose. From a distance, the Sondergerät 9 looked alien, a menacing, squat shape hunched low on the airfield tarmac of the remote Erprobungsstelle testing facility near Kassel. It looked like a brutal, functional hybrid, part rocket plane due to its radical, swept-wing design intended for high-speed evasion after the strike, and part flying generator due to the sheer bulk of the power equipment it carried. Its fuselage was short and thick, its profile dominated not by fuel or ordnance bays, but by the heavy, shielded core of the electromagnetic weapon. The conventional elements were kept minimal, a concession to the practicalities of flight. Mounted under the short, robust wings were twin Argus's 014 pulse-jet nacelles. These were the same crude, loud, and inefficient engines that powered the notorious V-1 flying bomb, chosen not for their elegance or reliability, but for their simplicity, ease of production, and, crucially, their low weight relative to the thrust they provided. Their rhythmic, stuttering roar would serve as the Nebelgeist's metallic heartbeat during its brief, deadly dash. The heart of the ghost, but the true, terrifying focal point of the Sondergerät 9 was the nose assembly. Gone was the sleek aerodynamic fairing common to German high-speed experimental craft. In its place, bolted into the nose, was a massive, shallow dish-like emitter. This was the antenna array, a focused electromagnetic cannon that looked deceptively simple but contained an intricate series of waveguides and phasing elements designed to concentrate the microwave energy into a devastating beam. Surrounding this emitter were thick, convoluted improvised coolant coils and bundles of massive, armored cabling. The need for such extreme cooling spoke volumes. The power density required to achieve atmospheric overloading meant that the magnetron system would generate heat approaching that of a small furnace. The coils, pumping a high-pressure mix of water and ethylene glycol, were an emergency measure, an attempt to delay the almost inevitable thermal runaway that would melt the expensive components and destroy the aircraft. The cables, thick as a man's forearm and encased in lead-impregnated rubber, channeled the lethal flow of high-tension electricity from the fuselage-mounted power core to the emitter. The voltage barrier, the fundamental engineering problem, was obvious immediately to any technician who dared approach the machine. The Nebelgeist was not a refinement of existing technology, it was a violent attempt to punch through known physical barriers. To generate the necessary electronic distortion field, the focused burst of microwaves that would cook enemy radar, the emitter required voltage levels that made V-2 rocket controls look like toys. The V-2 missile, an engineering marvel in its own right, operated on manageable, if high, voltages for its guidance and control systems. The Nebelgeist, however, demanded a momentary, staggering spike of power, pulling every available electron from its generator to overload the external atmosphere. This power was generated and stored in a central compartment, the dark heart of the machine. It contained the custom-built magnetron and its feeder system, routed through colossal, cylindrical capacitors so volatile that one engineer compared them to glass grenades. These weren't the neat, standardized components of mass production, they were experimental, high-density storage units, forced to hold a charge far exceeding safe tolerances. A single short circuit, a thermal runaway, or a manufacturing defect in the glass dielectric could result in a catastrophic, instantaneous electrical explosion. The cost in men and morale. The environment within the hangar that housed the Sondergrit 9 was one of constant, palpable dread. The sheer destructive energy that the machine was designed to contain corrupted the air around it. The constant hum of the charging circuits, the smell of ozone, and the required proximity to high-voltage equipment quickly decimated the morale of the technical teams. During assembly trials, 2 technicians were nearly killed. In the first incident, a sudden, uncontrolled discharge, a precursor to the eventual weapon activation, jumped a 3-meter gap, vaporizing the insulating grease on a busbar. The resulting arc flash caused severe burns to one technician and left the other with temporary, profound retinal damage. They were lucky. They were outside the immediate electromagnetic field of the emitter itself. The warnings were not subtle. They were searing, blinding reality. The chief propulsion mechanic, a seasoned man who had worked on everything from the Messerschmitt Me 200 jet program to submarine diesel engines, simply refused to enter the hangar when the high-voltage systems were active. He stood outside, chain-smoking, stating plainly that the machine was not built to fly, but to destroy its cradle. And yet, despite the near-fatal accidents, the mounting sense of danger, and the technical reports warning of fundamental instability, Dr. Kranz remained fanatical. His genius was tethered to a dangerous, almost metaphysical conviction in the project's success. He dismissed the accidents as the inevitable price of pioneering. With a chilling disregard for his own safety or the lives of his crew, Kranz insisted a test flight was imminent. He was so certain, so consumed by the need to prove his theories, that he made an astonishing and terrifying declaration. He even volunteered to fly the aircraft himself. This was not heroism. It was the ultimate expression of his unstable genius, a final, reckless wager on the purity of his equations versus the messy reality of physics. That's when the inevitable, cold hand of the German bureaucracy intervened. An outside force, equally ruthless but guided by a different, darker form of pragmatism, arrived on the scene. A black Horsch staff car, gleaming even in the dreary, late-war environment, drove onto the isolated apron. That's when the SS inspection team arrived. And everything changed. The Sonderprüfgruppe. Drawing the line, the team that arrived at the Kranz facility was no ordinary procurement or safety committee. They were the Sonderprüfgruppe, the special testing group, from the SS Technical Bureau. This unit was responsible for evaluating and, crucially, approving the Reich's most desperate and morally toxic weaponry. They were the ultimate auditors of acceptable risk in a regime that had normalized mass murder. The history of this group was a catalogue of horrific, last-ditch measures. They were the same unit that had approved human torpedoes, where pilots were sealed into miniature submarines with a one-way path to the target. They sanctioned the use of explosive gliders piloted by volunteers who knew their final approach was a collision, and they oversaw the development of all manner of other last-resort suicide weapons. If anyone could be expected to overlook the dangers of the Nebelgeist, it was these men. They traded in human life as a commodity for technical advantage. They performed a meticulous, 3-day inspection. Unlike the Abwehr, they focused less on material costs and more on operational viability and the sheer, raw destructive potential. They ran simulations based on Kranz's own data, cross-referenced the technical schematics with available knowledge on microwave exposure, and examined the proposed flight profile. Their assessment focused not on the effectiveness against the enemy, but on the threat posed to the pilot himself. The astonishing verdict, the written assessment that returned to SS headquarters, was an astonishing document, stark and uncompromising. It was a rejection of the Nebelgeist that transcended mere engineering caution. It was a chilling recognition of a machine's capacity to turn on its operator. The device exhibits electromagnetic output strong enough to cause fatal neurological disruption to the operator. The present shielding is demonstrably inadequate, leading to excessive microwave energy leakage into the cockpit enclosure. No pilot may be exposed to such conditions. The conclusion was brutal, scientific, and absolutely final. The SS, masters of human expendability, had finally encountered a machine whose internal logic was so lethal that it offended even their cynical sense of military utility. Translated, the plane cooked its pilot. The concept of the Nebelgeist required generating a pulse of focused microwave energy so potent that it could overcome atmospheric attenuation and damage hardened enemy electronics. The very nature of this power meant that, despite the lead-line shielding Kranz had incorporated, a massive microwave backwash, a field of stray, highly energetic radiation, flooded the cockpit when the emitter was energized. Microwaves, the same electromagnetic energy used to heat food, do not simply jam the human body, they excite water molecules, generating heat. In high concentrations, this energy can cause rapid, localized overheating and cellular damage, particularly in tissues with poor blood circulation to dissipate the heat, like the eyes and the brain. The Sonderprüfgruppe's prototype measurements showed effects that ranged from immediate incapacitation to certain death. Instant cataract formation. The delicate lens of the eye, mostly composed of protein and water, would absorb the microwave energy without the ability to cool itself, causing the proteins to denature, to literally coagulate and cook. This would result in immediate, blinding white opacity. Nerve firing irregularities. The electrical signaling system of the central nervous system would be corrupted by the sheer electromagnetic intensity, leading to profound sensory confusion, loss of motor control, and staggering disorientation. Blackouts. The brain itself, momentarily overwhelmed and overheated, would fail to sustain consciousness. Potential cardiac arrest. The most terrifying prospect was the possibility of a direct, fatal electrical interference with the heart's natural pacemaker function, causing an acute myocardial event. Crucially, this was before the aircraft even left the ground. The measurements were taken during ground power-up trials, running the weapon system for a fraction of a second. An operational strike required sustained emission for several critical seconds, accelerating the physiological breakdown to an almost instantaneous event. The incompatibility of risk. The SS officer in charge of the inspection, a Colonel Richter, reportedly engaged in a brief, cold confrontation with Dr. Kranz, a moment that encapsulated the machine's fundamental, tragic flaw. Richter, known for his clinical detachment, looked at the schematics, looked at the Sondergurt 9, and then looked at the frenetic, unblinking Kranz. He reportedly asked the question that stripped the project bare: why do you need an enemy if the machine already kills the man using it? For the SS, even the most extreme weapon had to adhere to a morbid calculus of war. The gain must be greater than the loss. The Nebelgeist guaranteed the destruction of one highly trained German pilot for a theoretical, unproven kill of an enemy installation. It was a net loss, a guaranteed suicide for questionable gain. It was too unstable, too random, and too corrosive to morale. The verdict was immediate and absolute. The project was halted. The technical facility was ordered to stand down the moment the SS inspection team departed. Dr. Erhard Kranz was not arrested or executed. His genius was still considered too valuable to the Reich's dwindling scientific base, but he was decisively removed from all flight-related work and reassigned to non-hazardous, theoretical research on guided ballistics. For any normal scientist, in any normal time, this would have been the end. The final, damning judgment from the Reich's ultimate arbiters of death. The Nebelgeist would have been disassembled, its secrets filed away, to be discovered decades later as a morbid curiosity, but Dr. Erhard Kranz was neither normal nor willing to accept the reality of defeat. He was the architect of the impossible, and the finality of the SS's rejection did not break him. It merely redirected his obsessive focus, but Kranz did not accept the decision. For him, the flaw wasn't in the concept, it was in the pilot, the fragile, organic, irreplaceable component. The challenge, therefore, was not to fix the shielding, but to remove the man. His next step would plunge the Nebelgeist concept into a new, darker phase, moving from manned desperation to pure, unmanned automation. The rejection of the Nebelgeist by the SS was not merely a bureaucratic failure for Dr. Erhard Kranz, it was the ultimate professional humiliation and the denial of his life's work. To a man defined by his reckless genius and fanatical belief in his own equations, this was a wound that could only be salved by absolute, undeniable proof. Reassigned and monitored, Kranz was a caged animal, yet his mind, still sharp and incandescent, was already mapping out the final, unauthorized experiment. The environment in which this final act played out was the perfect stage for such doomed defiance. January 18, 1945, was a date etched in the memory of the crumbling Reich, a time of deepening despair. The Soviets were pouring across the Vistula, the last German offensive in the Ardennes had failed catastrophically, and the industrial heartland was under daily aerial assault. Survival had replaced victory as the only goal. On this night, a heavy snowstorm descended upon the remote Kassel testing facility. The thick, silent snow did more than chill the air, it muffled all sound, turning the vast, desolate airfield into an echoing landscape of white and shadow. It was the perfect shroud for a forbidden experiment. Kranz was prepared. Driven by a clarity bordering on madness, he coordinated his final operation with the precision of a thief. With the aid of 2 loyal technicians, men whose belief in the doctor bordered on cultish devotion, or perhaps men too terrified to refuse, Kranz executed his plan. Under the cover of the storm, they bypassed the minimal night security, the guards being more concerned with keeping warm than with the phantom secrets held within the massive steel doors. Kranz and his men broke into Hangar 7, the cavernous, cold tomb of the Sondergurt 9. Overloading the Ghost, the subsequent events in Hangar 7 unfolded with a terrifying, almost ritualistic efficiency, guided by Kranz's obsessive knowledge of the machine's architecture. There was no pre-flight checklist, no safety protocol, only the single-minded pursuit of the weapon's maximum output. First, they worked on the airframe. The technicians manually pressurized the fuel lines and engaged the auxiliary battery, ready to power the pulse jet engines manually, a necessary step for generating the massive electrical power required, even if the engines would never run to full thrust inside the hangar. Next, the most dangerous step, the capacitor bank. The core of the Nebelgeist, the fragile glass grenades holding the concentrated electrical potential, was rated for a maximum sustainable charge. Kranz, however, was not interested in sustainability. He needed a single, maximum spike of power to prove the principle of atmospheric overloading. With the technicians nervously adjusting the primary transformer settings, Kranz directed them to bypass the safety relays. They deliberately overloaded the capacitors to 120% of the theoretical limit. The air in the compartment would have crackled with ozone, and the massive, custom-built power conduits must have groaned audibly under the strain. Then came the final, fatal preparation. Kranz dismissed his technicians, sealing them safely, or so he claimed, behind the thick concrete blast wall. He did not put on the heavy, insulated flight suit, a futile gesture against the microwave field anyway, or the lead-lined helmet proposed in the original design. Dr. Erhard Kranz, the architect of the machine, climbed into the cockpit of the Sondergurt 9, a space designed for a human, yet engineered to be its demise, and sealed the canopy. He was alone, strapped into the epicenter of a contained electromagnetic apocalypse, prepared to sacrifice himself for the sake of an equation. The flash of incandescence outside Hangar 7, the 2 technicians and the handful of bewildered security guards could only wait in the snow-muffled silence. They heard the generators whine, a high-pitched scream that cut through the storm, building in intensity as the capacitors reached their lethal maximum charge. The hangar's massive doors, though closed, were not perfectly sealed. Through the gaps, the waiting men saw it. The inside of the hangar flashed white, a profound, instantaneous illumination. It was not like a light bulb that glows with filament heat, but like sheet lightning, a pure, spectral discharge, the momentary visual signature of an unimaginable release of concentrated electrical energy. The flash signified the moment the power stored in the volatile capacitors surged into the colossal magnetron, forcing it to fire its beam. The emitter activated. The energy, now focused and driven to its atmospheric overloading potential, momentarily warped the immediate physical environment inside the sealed hangar. Witnesses saw the air shimmer around the nose of the aircraft. This was the physical realization of Kranz's theory. The brief, localized ionization of the air, the birth of the plasma field, the true ghost in the mist, finally brought to life. It was a visible distortion, a shimmering halo of intense energy radiating from the dish-like emitter. The effects were immediate and physical. Tools and metal crates nearby vibrated violently, humming with an induced current, dancing in the unseen electromagnetic bath. One guard described a pressure wave that felt like my brain was rattling. This was likely the concurrent effect of the system's massive electromagnetic pulse (EMP), creating a sudden, violent displacement of air molecules, coupled with the immediate physiological shock of the microwave backwash penetrating the human body. Silence and failure. The destructive sequence was swift, cascading, and self-terminating. The Nebelgeist was not just attacking the air around it, it was consuming itself. Then the prototype's landing lights flickered. The incandescent bulbs, momentarily stressed by the overwhelming electrical demands, glowed unnaturally bright. Then they died. The power surged back on the line, overwhelming the aircraft's own, unprotected minor electrical systems. Then every electrical device in the hangar, alarms, radios, even a guard's wristwatch, failed simultaneously. The EMP effect, unleashed in the enclosed space, had instantaneously fried the delicate, unshielded electronics of the immediate area. The silence that followed the generator's scream and the flash was total, absolute, and eerie. It was the sound of electronic death. The security team, realizing the catastrophe was now internal and contained, forced their way into the hangar. The air was thick with the sharp, acrid smell of ozone and burnt insulation. When the emergency team forced the cockpit open, they found Dr. Kranz exactly where he had strapped himself in. He was still, frighteningly, alive. The sheer, raw power of the discharge had instantly vaporized some of the internal components, causing the system to collapse under its own force, thus limiting the duration of the lethal blast. He was not killed instantly by the cardiac shock or total organ failure, but the protection was not enough. The microwave energy had done its intended work on the closest, most susceptible organ. Dr. Kranz could no longer see. His eyes, the very instruments of his genius and the windows to his fanaticism, were destroyed. His retinas were burned white, the lens structures having flash cooked in the field of concentrated microwaves. He was alive, silent, and irrevocably blind. Dr. Erhard Kranz, the man who designed a weapon to blind the enemy, died 2 days later in the facility's infirmary, not from the initial trauma, but from systemic breakdown caused by the full-body, high-intensity radiation exposure. He had proven his machine worked, but only at the cost of his life and his vision, a final, macabre symmetry to his fate. The SS technical unit arrived the following morning, the snow still falling softly. With cold efficiency, the Nebelgeist prototype was quietly dismantled under SS supervision, reduced to its component parts, the ultimate proof of its lethal potential secured and categorized. The remains were loaded onto sealed rail cars and shipped to an underground depot in Thuringia, destined for the Reich's deep, subterranean storage facilities, a secret that would soon pass into the hands of the victors. The machine was never flown, but it had achieved its objective, absolute electronic destruction. The scavenger hunt of empire. The end of the war was a technological free-for-all, a frenzied, desperate scavenger hunt of empire. As Allied and Soviet forces carved up the remains of the Third Reich, specialized technical intelligence teams, the American Operation Paperclip and the British Target Intelligence Committee T-Force mirrored by Soviet special brigades, swept through captured research facilities. Their mission was not merely to find documents, but to locate and recruit the scientists and appropriate the secret Wunderwaffen that had consumed billions of Reichsmarks and countless lives. When the Allies entered the region months later, the Kassel airfield and the facility at Thuringia were complex prizes. The underground depot was secured, and amid the thousands of crates containing parts for jet engines, rocket prototypes, and exotic munitions, they found scattered crates labeled Sondergerät 9. They contained the pulse jet nacelles, the structural components, and the shattered cockpit frame. The physical aircraft was recovered, but the central, most terrifying component was gone. The emitter core, the colossal magnetron assembly and its volatile capacitor bank, was missing. It had been expertly and deliberately removed, leaving behind only the heavy, armored cabling and the empty socket in the nose. The Germans, in the final, chaotic days of the collapse, had chosen to either destroy the core or, far more likely, move it to an even deeper, more secure location, or passed it to a friendly force for safekeeping. The invisible transfer. The trail of the Nebelgeist's electronic heart led into the murky world of espionage and tactical surrender. A heavily redacted note in British intelligence archives from late 1945 provides the chilling next chapter. A device of unusual electromagnetic design, exhibiting characteristics inconsistent with conventional jamming or radar, was transferred to Soviet custody under conditions currently classified. This suggests a classic scenario of late-war bargaining. A German unit, trapped and faced with capture by the Western Allies, chose to surrender their technical treasure to the Soviets, often viewed as the greater evil, in exchange for better treatment or simply to keep the secrets out of British or American hands. What is certain is that the core technology did not vanish. The Soviets later pursued several high-power microwave weapon tests in the late 1940s and early 1950s, all of them extremely classified and focused on directed energy for military applications. The schematics and theoretical papers they used bore a suspicious similarity to the surviving documents from Dr. Kranz's project. The Soviet focus on high-power, broadband electromagnetic attack, designed not just to jam but to destroy enemy electronic infrastructure, was a dark echo of the Nebelgeist's central concept. The Ghost in the Mist had simply changed uniforms, its destructive principles now absorbed into the Cold War's arms race. The true cost of genius is for the Nebelgeist aircraft itself, the Sondergurt 9. Nothing more was ever officially recorded after its dismantling. It became a piece of historical detritus, a curiosity to be studied, measured, and filed away. The story of its internal, lethal flaw, however, resonated through the intelligence community long after the war's end. One RAF intelligence officer, Group Captain Leslie Selden, who spent months sifting through captured German technical reports, encapsulated the project's unique tragedy in his post-war memoir, The Silence of the Airwaves. His observation serves as the final, profound epitaph for Kranz and his ghost plane. Some German projects were abandoned because they didn't work. They were technically unfeasible or strategically irrelevant. Others because they worked too well. The Nebelgeist was the latter. It proved a principle too dangerous to its own side to ever see the light of day. It was perfect destruction, but indiscriminately applied. The machine was not a failure of design. It was an unprecedented success in weaponizing physics against life itself, starting with the life of the pilot. To this day, the archives of the pre-unification Luftwaffe registry list the Sondergurt 9 under its technical designation, its termination status a rare admission of ethical, or perhaps pragmatic, defeat. Project terminated due to unacceptable pilot risk. And in the entire, horrifying history of Nazi weapons development, a history replete with V-weapons, chemical warfare, and self-sacrifice attacks, this stands as one of the few, remarkable instances when even the SS, stood ready to deploy any atrocity. The last people you'd expect to hesitate looked at a machine born of pure, reckless genius and the promise of absolute, destructive power, and said with finality, no. Absolutely not. The Nebelgeist remains a whisper in the archives, a testament not to a failure of science, but to a terrifying success, the point where the tools of war outpaced the very biological capacity of the men intended to wield them. It was a machine that guaranteed victory over the enemy's electronics, but guaranteed the death of its operator. And in that fatal internal contradiction, the Ghost in the Mist finally found its peace, buried under the snow of 1945.